Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'm pleased to introduce you to the most unique tour or the most unique lecture in the history of the BGES. Our speaker is former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. Eagleburger passed away several years ago, but I had a long-standing interest in international relations long before I started Blue and Gray. I was a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I always remembered seeing Eagleburger as both a talking head and as a career civil servant. I also remember Eagleburger in the first Gulf War in the early 90s, in which George Bush went in to put together a coalition of countries to thrash Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis for invading Kuwait. And I remember seeing Eagleburger occasionally giving interviews and so forth. At the time, he was an undersecretary of state under George H.W. Bush. And when the war started, he was sent to Tel Aviv with the express purpose and responsibility of keeping the Israelis out of the war, because the coalition was a coalition of Western armies and Arab armies who were chastising another Arab brother. And they knew that Saddam would try to light up the whole Middle East by drawing Israel into the war to break up the coalition that Bush and Colin Powell had put together. And so Eagleburger, who had accepted a great many important diplomatic postings in his career, received perhaps his most important posting, which was this to keep the Israelis from retaliating to provocation when Scud missiles were launched into Israel, trying to provoke a response. It was Eagleburger who got more Patriot air defense missile batteries and sat with the Israeli leadership to assure them that the United States and the Saudis would not allow attacks on Israel to go unpunished. And he was successful at that. The Israelis stayed out of the war, and Saddam was defeated, boxed up, and pushed out of Kuwait, and would remain boxed up for the better part of 9 or 10 years. Eagleburger's reward was when Secretary of State Howard Baker, who was a close confidant of President H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, decided to retire and then go back into assisting Bush in his unsuccessful reelection campaign against Bill Clinton and Ross Perot. Eagleburger received his reward for having been so successful, and he was named the Secretary of State of the United States for the last 5 or 6 months of George H.W. Bush's tenure. And of course, then when Clinton came in, Eagleburger was replaced by Warren Christopher. Eagleburger was alert. He was interested in the Civil War. He was from Wisconsin and had a long-standing interest in the Iron Brigade. The story of how Eagleburger and I met is a fascinating and interesting story, and I'll take a minute to share it with you. In the early goings in Blue and Gray, I didn't have an office or anything. I was generally working out of my house because we were pretty small and so forth. And so I had a room set up in the back of the house here in Danville, Virginia. And my wife was at work one day, and I was sitting around processing maybe the 1 or 2 checks I'd gotten that day, because we didn't have a whole lot of money in those days either. And just cogitating on what the future might hold, when the phone rang, and I picked up, answered, and lady's voice on the other end said, "Call for Mr. Leonard Rydell, please." I said, "Speaking." Says, "Hold on for the secretary." I said, "Okay, what's this all about?" I had no idea, because she hadn't identified herself or anything. She just was looking for me, and the man came on the line very quickly and said, "Hello, Major Rydell. This is Larry Eagleburger." Yeah, I know who that is. I said, yes, Mr. Secretary. And he said, oh, please call me Larry. He said, I've been a member of the Civil War Trust for a while, and I had heard through grapevine that you had started the Civil Blue and Gray Education Society, and it's kind of in line with what I'm interested in. And um, I was wondering if I could join your organization and if there was anything I could do to help. And I'm, it's one of these, you wake up in the morning, you say, geez, I wonder what today is going to bring. And I've had some surprises before, but nothing like this. And I said, well, I'm delighted to talk to you, Mr. Secretary. And we got into discussion. We talked a bit about the Iron Brigade and stuff. And he said, well, I'm going to join the organization. How much money do you need? And where should I send the check? And so I told him, and he sent some money in and so forth. And when the shock of talking to him, he gave me his personal number to call him and so forth, because he was retired. He was up in Charlottesville, Virginia, just outside Charlottesville, living on Owensville Road. And he was there with his wife, and he had a studio there because he was a talking head for most networks as a former Secretary of State. And so he had his own studio and transmitter and stuff that the networks had made available to him. And he invited me to come up, and I did. And we sat down and we talked. Well, he says, well, what can I do to help you? And at that time, Winston Groom, who's also subsequently passed away in September last year, had come into our organization, into our life. And I said, well, I'm looking to get some heft behind the organization. Would you consider being honorary national membership chairman for the organization and help us with membership? And he says, be delighted to. He said, would you like to use my my ink pen, my signature pen? I said, yeah. He says, okay. He says, here's what we'll do. And so he provided me with stationery and the ability to basically have his name signed to letters over his Secretary of State, his emeritus retired Secretary of State letterhead, with his name on the embossed name on the return envelope. And I could also put the blue and gray logo on there and send a letter to people signed by Larry Eagleburger asking them to join him in supporting blue and gray. And it worked. It really did. People re-upped, and it was very, very successful. And Larry would invite me to stop through on any of my many trips up to the Northern Virginia and so forth. And I availed myself of that. Sometimes I visited for 15, 20 minutes. Sometimes would sit down and talk foreign affairs for an hour or more. The relationship was a very, very good relationship, and it remained that way all the days until he passed away. In this case, about a year later, with his support and being the national membership chairman and so forth, I asked him if he would be willing to come over from Charlottesville and speak to this group of people, and he agreed to do that. He agreed to try to do the Iron Brigade. I had given him a whole bunch of books on the Iron Brigade and so forth. And he admitted to me, he says, I've read a few of them. I read Alan Nolan's book. He said, but I couldn't get through all of them and stuff. He says, do you mind if I do a contemporary lecture on foreign affairs? Because that's something I know about. So, well, hell's bells. Yes, of course. And so that's what this is. This is a little over an hour of Larry Eagleburger standing up. He's unmasked. He's unreserved. He speaks candidly and honestly. And those of you who have a sense of history and what was going on and so forth, he talks about a one superpower world. He talks about problems in leadership in a one superpower world and why the United States was having some difficulties. It is just a fascinating lecture. And I think if you watch this once, chances are you'll watch it again and again. So please sit back and relax and enjoy the former United States Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, talking about the United States and foreign affairs at the end of the 20th century. Under President George Bush. However, he has a very detailed and interesting resume, which
you're not going
which I'm not going to read. So send it to me. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to my secretary. However, Secretary Eagleburger has agreed to speak with us this evening about foreign affairs, and this conversation is off the record, so whichever.
I don't care.
You don't care? It's on the record. Make it happen.
Since I'm out of government and no longer am responsible for what I say. I am uncuffed. Can you hear me back there?
No. Not too good. The mic's not on.
How about now? Better? Anything else I can do for you now before I go? I am uncomfortably aware that I mean, I'm a Civil War buff, but there's nobody in this room who isn't a good bit more expert than I, so I am not here to talk to you about the Civil War today. I will talk a little bit about foreign policy, and I know that's intimately related to the Civil War. If I can find the relationship, I'll try. But anyway, I at least ought to talk about something I have some modest claim to, and that's going to have to be foreign policy. I would only say to you that as far as the Civil War is concerned, since I come from the state of Wisconsin, which produced without any doubt whatsoever the best unit in either army, I am very objective. You know, the Iron Brigade was clearly beyond question, as good as, at least as good as anything in either army. So I take a certain pride in that. And I was discussing here earlier, it's been my impression that you here in the South still are much more emotionally attached to the Civil War than is the case in the North, but Jesus. All I can tell you is no wonder you lost. Anyway, where the hell was I? When Len asked me to do this, I have a reputation for putting my foot in my mouth, like for instance saying that the North had a better unit than anybody in the South, which upset some people clearly. That I have a tendency to put my foot in my mouth, so I promised him that I would conduct myself tonight within the context of the Machiavelli principle. And I'm now going to explain to you what the Machiavelli principle is. And for those of you who are so clearly Southerners, probably don't know who Machiavelli was in the first place. Let me simply explain. He was an Italian diplomat at one point, and somebody I've always admired during the Renaissance. But anyway, he was dying, and they got a priest at the church to come and give him the last rites. And he was lying on the deathbed, and the priest said, my son, do you repent of your sins and renounce the devil?" And there was no answer. So he asked 2 or 3 more times again without an answer. So finally in frustration, the priest said, "I ask you for the last time. Do you repent of your sins and renounce the devil?" Machiavelli looked at him and said, "This is no time to make new enemies." So I will try not to make any new enemies aside from the one I've already made. And I won't talk about the Civil War at all. Though I envy you people for the time you've been able to spend here in the last few days. It is clearly the single most important national event in our 200 and some years of history, and it's absolutely fascinating stuff. Anyway, early in the Bush administration, which I was honored to serve in, God called Bush, Gorbachev, who was still head of what was then the Soviet Union, and Yitzhak Shamir, who was Prime Minister of Israel, to heaven. And he said, "Gentlemen, I have had it with the human race. I'm going to destroy you all next week in a flood, and I want you to go back and tell your people." So George Bush came back and got on American television. He said, people of the United States, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is that there is a God. I met with him, talked to him, he does exist. The bad news is that he's going to destroy the human race in a week. Gorbachev got on Soviet television. He said, people of the Soviet Union, I have some bad news and I have some worse news. The bad news is that there is a God. And the worst news is he's going to destroy the human race in a week, in a flood. Shamir got on Israeli television and said, people of Israel, I have some good news and I have some better news. The good news is that there is a God. Talk to him, he does exist. The better news is that there will never be a Palestinian state. Now there is a point to this story, I think, which is that the good news for all of us in the West is that we won the Cold War. And it was largely through the leadership of the United States after some 45 to 50 years of really steady leadership on the part of this country, Republican and Democratic administrations. It didn't really make any difference. And as a consequence of that commitment and the building of the alliances we built with other free nations over a period of that 4.5 decades, we, without firing a shot at them, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. And by and large, we did it. And it is historically almost unique in history in terms of the alliance we were able to put together and the things we were able to accomplish leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that today, the danger of a nuclear Armageddon, at least between the two superpowers, no longer exists. There's only one superpower, us. The bad news, however, is that as we have discovered and see in our newspapers every day, just because the Cold War is over does not mean that everything is hunky-dory. If you take a look at the newspapers and read about Bosnia or Nagorno-Karabakh or the Indians blowing up an atomic weapon here last week or this week, you go through all of that and you realize fairly quickly that the world is still substantially unstable. And in some ways I would suggest to you more unstable than it ever was during the worst days of the Cold War. And as we move into the 21st century, we Americans are going to have to take a deep breath and a hard look at all of this, because the fact of the matter is that having spent the last 50 years committing ourselves to a particular course of action which succeeded, and thereby hoping that at the end of that we were going to be able to put down our burdens, I would suggest to you that that's not the case. And that in fact, the next century can be a pretty awful mess if we are not careful. Don't have to work too hard to remember that the first 50 years of the 20th century were probably as bad as any 50 years in human history. We succeeded in killing more people, having worse depressions, and that great thing called concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, and so forth. And we really outdid ourselves as a human race in terms of our viciousness over that 50-year period. Now, I'm not suggesting that the next 50 years will look like that, but I am suggesting that if we are not careful as we go into the next century, we are going to find ourselves faced with a whole host of serious instabilities. And again, I would come back to say the Indian example here several days ago is the beginning of one of the kinds of things I'm talking about. Because while we have successfully walked away from the danger of a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, I would suggest to you that it is possible, and I frankly think probable, that within the next 10 or 20 years, we will see a nuclear weapon used by somebody in anger, which we saw not once, not at all during the days of the Cold War. And the problem here is the whole issue of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, whether it be nuclear, biological, or chemical. And on none of the three do we really have a clear handle on how to deal with those problems, or how to police the process so that these weapons are not developed, much less used. The way we are at the point floundering around with regard to India is a simple example of what I'm talking about. Floundering is the wrong word, I guess, because what we have discovered is we're the world's only superpower, but the Indians can thumb their nose at us and blow up a couple of these weapons. And we can get righteously and I think properly indignant and impose some sanctions, and Bill Clinton can go off to Scotland and find absolutely no support whatsoever from anybody, the British, the French, the Russians, anybody, the Germans, anybody of the major 8 countries in the world, no support whatsoever for trying to put some pressure on the Indians to at least make sure that it doesn't happen again. We have the Deputy Secretary of State in Islamabad trying to persuade the Pakistanis not to repeat what the Indians have done, and maybe he will succeed, but the fact of the matter again is here's the world's only superpower, and we are in Islamabad practically on our knees begging the Pakistanis not to do what the Indians have done. Again, I'm not complaining, I am simply pointing out to you that here is the United States, for one more time, the only superpower left on the face of this earth, and we find ourselves with very little ability to get our way on some really very critical issues. And I would suggest to you that what the Indians have done is important and dangerous, not so much because of the Indians per se. We've known for a long time they had nuclear weapons. And not even so much as a thumbing their noses at the Pakistanis, which may lead the Pakistanis to retaliate, but rather what the Indians have done now is opened up Pandora's box. And the nightmare we face with regard to this issue of nuclear weapons is in fact that any number of independent countries, none of them particularly powerful, at least certainly not in terms of comparison with us, are now encouraged to continue this process of building and again exploiting nuclear weapons. And our ability to control that is at best moderate, even if we got a lot tougher than we now are. And the point here is, if the world is going to be faced over the course of the next several decades with the potential use of a nuclear weapon by some pipsqueak state, you have to ask yourself, what kind of a world is it we may well be entering into? And I would suggest to you that of the three classes of weapons I've just talked about, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, interestingly enough, the nuclear weapons issue is the easiest of the three to manage, at least in terms of knowing what's going on. Okay, so the CIA may have blown it here and not known in this particular case that the Indians were about to test these weapons. But you know, that aside from the fact that it'll give a couple of senators in the Senate a chance to pound their chest and look tough and beat the hell out of the head of the CIA, the fact of the matter is, so we slipped up once, but the fact of the matter also is we knew when they blew the weapon off, and we by and large know who is building these weapons and where. When you get to the issue of chemical weapons, and more importantly the issue of biological weapons, our ability to know what's being done, much less knowing how to deal with it, is even less. We learned when we decided that Saddam Hussein had done enough damage and we decided we were going to go in and teach him a lesson. We learned when we went into Iraq how much closer he was to the development of a nuclear weapon than we had thought, or that the International Atomic Energy Agency had thought. He was not far away from a weapon. Thank goodness that's no longer the case. We have pretty well wrecked his ability to build one. But my point again here is, put yourself 10 years from now and you have another Saddam Hussein or a North Korean leader or Gaddafi. You can name several. Any one of whom probably views global stability as anathema and probably believes that his chances of a successful policy would be to threaten, if not to use a nuclear weapon on an occasion. Certainly I think Saddam Hussein would have used it if he had had it handy. But in the hands of a country that cares less about stability, and in fact because it may be in trouble at home domestically, may decide that the best way to get out of that is with some foreign adventure, and here North Korea bothers me a great deal in this regard. We may well find ourselves facing the fact that somebody has shot a nuclear weapon in anger, which has not happened since Nagasaki in 1945. And the question then becomes, how do we deal with that? Or do we deal with it at all? Or is it somebody else's problem? I mention this only as an example of what I think is a much broader issue than this. If you go through some of the issues that are going to face us, certainly the Bosnia-type adventures that we now see are that's not going to be just limited to Bosnia. There are any number of countries around the world where either they are already engaged in what I would describe as tribal warfare, or are on the edges of it. And in what's going on in Bosnia is nothing more nor less than a European example of tribal warfare. And I've spent 7 years of my life in Yugoslavia off and on. I think I know a little bit about it. And I must tell you that you do not root out 500 years of history in 50 years. Tito did his damnedest, but it didn't work. I mean, he really did everything he could to drive out this nationality question in the way in which it has now manifested itself in Serbia and Yugoslavia. And I'm reasonably confident that when we pull out our troops and the rest of the world does the same, they will happily return to killing each other. And maybe if we stay there for 10 years, that won't be the case, but I can assure you we're going to be there a fairly long period of time, no matter what guarantees the president may have made on how soon we would leave. And this leads to the second point I would make, which is, where do we have troops today? In Haiti, in Macedonia, in Bosnia. We had them in Somalia for a while. We've got them spread around the world. And why? Because there is no international system, there's no collective force built out of the combination of forces from a number of countries that can in fact go into a place when there's really a serious issue of stability. And as a consequence, what we find ourselves doing, we Americans, is putting troops out to put out fires, and they stay there for substantial periods of time. I won't even try to describe to you what's happened to our defense establishment and our defense readiness as a consequence of having pilots flying around in the Middle East to observe what's going on in Iraq, for example. But I was at the Air War College, or the Air Academy rather, in Colorado just about 10 days ago. And I sat there with some generals as they described to me what's happening to the readiness of our Air Force. It is steadily going down. They are losing pilots steadily because there is not sufficient replacement. So some of these kids are just worn out and they are leaving. We're in the process, without really, I think, recognizing it too well, we are in the process of really undoing our whole defense posture. And it worries me, it ought to worry us all, because again, the point is, as we go into this next century, there is, at least in my judgment, given the clear dangers of instabilities developing in a number of different parts of the world, Indonesia right now, I mean, if you stand around for 15 or 20 minutes, I can probably give you 3 more examples as they pop up. And the point is, that's not going to stop. And in each case, we are now faced with the fact that either we act or nobody acts. And instead of spending a lot of time trying to go on, because I really would prefer to answer questions, but let me make the point this way. There is only one country on the face of this earth that thinks globally, and that's us. That's not necessarily because we're smarter, but it is because we are the only country left on the face of this earth that has global interests. The British in the last century did. Strangely enough, the Soviet Union, in its own peculiar way, did. That is no longer the case. They spend most of the time contemplating their naval right now, as they try to, imagine going from being a superpower to a country that is heading the list of the underdeveloped world in the course of about 2 years. And think of what that does psychologically if you're a Russian, which is another reason we need to be worried as we go into this next century, because how are they going to accommodate to all of that? But my point, to get back to the basic point, is there is the possibilities of serious problems of stability which could lead to substantial killing, as in the Bosnian case, are fairly, the chances are fairly substantial if you try to take a look at where the world is and what the problems facing the world are at this stage. And that's not even to talk about the issues of an increasingly complicated world trading system, an increasingly complicated world financial system, in which the Secretary of the Treasury no longer really can control the money flow in the United States because it's zapped off to Berlin today and London tomorrow. The whole technological revolution has in fact taken away from the Secretary of the Treasury, or the President, as a matter of fact, a substantial ability to control our own currency. And these kinds of questions are all laying out there, many of them new, because of the revolutions in technology. And we Americans are faced with a question, which is, are we prepared to try, as we move into this next century, are we prepared to try to continue the kind of leadership that we exercise so well for the last 50 years as we move into the 2010, 2020, 2030? Or are we likely to say enough is enough, to pull in our horns, and in part with justice if things continue as they have, because there's no way in the world that this country should be the world's policeman. We couldn't afford it if we wanted to be. And it is clear that most Americans don't want that. And I can tell you this much. You begin a military adventure somewhere around the world, and if we begin to lose men, GIs, I can assure you from personal experience that the attitude of the American people does a 180-degree flip almost overnight, and they want out. So that the ability of the United States to commit to something over a steady long-term basis in the use of military power is no longer there, if it ever really was. So we get to the question of whether there isn't some ability to draw on the lessons we learned in the last 50 years, and principally there, to put together an alliance of like-minded democracies led by the United States that begins then to deal with these issues in a more systematic way. And what I would suggest to you is there's a crying need for is an America that no longer makes its decisions on an ad hoc basis. If tomorrow Haiti blows up, we're going to send troops there. But in fact, calls upon the British and the French and the Germans and the Japanese and anybody else that makes sense, and says, this world that we're now going into is going to be a very dangerous world, and it's going to be very, very time-consuming to try to deal with it. We Americans are not prepared to do it by ourselves. And it is time that we came together and thought very hard about how we can draw on the lessons of the last half of the 20th century and put together the kinds of coalitions that will begin to deal thoughtfully with these problems. Now, this may sound like the worst kind of naivete, and maybe it is. But the fact of the matter is that in a strange sort of a way, the collapse of the Soviet Union has put us in a very tough position. In the sense that when the Soviets were there, the threat of the Soviet Union was the kind of cement that held the West together. It was that threat that led us all to do some really very constructive and different sorts of things. Without that threat there any longer, it is going to be far more difficult for us to generate the kinds of collective action that are the only way we're going to get ourselves off the hook of being responsible to react against any particular crisis. The danger we face now is precisely that if we continue to do business as we are now doing it, it will be the United States every time that is called on to make the particular sacrifice necessary to contain a dangerous problem. And that is, seems to me a formula for clearly driving the American people back to a kind of neo-isolationism that none of us should want. So the alternative to that, to the degree I can see one, is that the United States needs to recognize that we need to begin hard work at putting together again, and with some forceful rhetoric if necessary, putting together again, if we can, the kind of Western collective action that was so successful in the last 50 years of this century. I can go on at length about specific problems if you want, but I believe this so deeply that any chance I get to talk to anybody about it, including crazy people who love the Civil War and are prepared to walk around in the woods in 90-degree heat.
You gotta be a little nuts.
Well, either you're nuts or you're overweight and you're trying to get rid of it. But anyway, anytime I get a chance to make this pitch, I want to make it because I feel so strongly that there is a real danger. One of two dangers faces. The one danger is that we believe we've succeeded as we have, and that therefore the United States no longer has any particular need for or responsibility for trying to manage the world, and we relax. And I do not mean this as a political comment, though my republicanism is, I think, without question. I'm not attacking Clinton when I say that the way he and his secretaries of state have managed foreign affairs has been very much on an ad hoc basis. When you get a problem, you try to deal with it. That is the traditional way in which we've handled foreign policy most of the time. So it's not a criticism, but it is in this sense a wake-up call that we can't continue to do that as we move into the 21st century, because it won't work. And we're going to have to find, it will only work marginally, because the other side of, the other danger, I said there were two. The one is we relax and try not to get involved. The other side of that coin is that we become very much involved, and I fear that in some ways that is the way we're going now. As we put troops everywhere we can find a place to put them. We become very much involved, and over time, two things happen out of that. One, our resources are strained and strained badly. And the second is that over time we're going to recognize that we can't do it all by ourselves, and we're going to return to the first danger, which is a sort of a neo-isolationism. And again, this is all potentially taking place at precisely the time that the economy of the globe is becoming global. At precisely the time that in terms of our economic interests, our trade interests, there's no way we can pack up and come home. And that in fact, if we try that, the economic consequences for the United States are going to be disastrous, because we no longer can live off our own market. We have to have a world market if we're going to be successful. And under those circumstances, we need a world that is reasonably stable so that we can conduct our economic and trade affairs that way. So I have, if I sound pessimistic, I'm not. Neither am I particularly optimistic, because, as I say, the fundamental question now is we need some leadership that begins to think strategically about the next century and what our interests are and what our obligations are, and begins to think that all through with like-minded allies around the world, more or less like-minded. On occasion we'll have to kick them right where it'll do them the most good. But the fact of the matter is, leadership requires that sort of thing. And we are not at this stage leading. Neither are we following, we're just reacting. And I really do hope that you understand this is not intended as a criticism of the administration. I'm not sure that we Republicans would have done it any better. But what is clear is that there's a new world out there staring us in the face, and we haven't really begun to think about how we deal with it. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have, starting with a long history of the Iron Brigade, if you like. Let's start at the back and work this way, in the back.
What is your opinion of the euro and the United Europe that's probably going to happen in the next 50 years?
If you give it 50 years, you're correct. Well, the euro, the monetary side of the thing is going to happen much sooner than that. And I guess my answer to you, to the best you can think it through in advance is, well, first of all, it's going to happen, so we're going to have to learn to live with it, the monetary side of it. Secondly, does it become a reserve currency that in fact begins to displace the dollar? I hope not, but it may. And the reason I hope not is because with all of the stress on the dollar, since it is the world's basic reserve currency, with all of the stress, it presents us with some really substantial benefits. And I would like to see that we continue to have those benefits. But I think the euro probably will certainly become, in the next 5 years or so, a relatively strong currency. Whether it replaces the dollar, I don't know, but it certainly will be the second reserve currency at least. On the trade side, the internal trade side, internal European trade side, and financial side, there's clearly going to be continued progress. So that economically, the European community will become more coherent as a whole and more efficient as a consequence. Politically, they are so far away from a political unity that gives them any ability to make decisions, to commit themselves as a whole to anything important. That's years and years away. And since that's years and years away, it is a fundamental weakness of the political unit that they're creating. So that I would say we've got 20 or 30 years at a minimum before, and that's at a minimum, believe me, before they are coherent enough on the world scene in economic and political terms that they begin to make much more difference than they now have. In the end, we have spent 50 years yelling about how the Europeans had to take on more responsibility, how they had to become more coherent, and how they had to step in and help us out. In the end, I think that it's probable, if we're smart in the process now, it is probable that they will be a useful and more powerful ally. But when I say we have to be smart in the process, the fundamental thing that we have to guard against right now is European protectionism. And what that means is we have got to be in Brussels, where the bureaucrats all sit, the community bureaucrats all sit. We've got to be in Brussels, we've got to be there every day, we've got to be monitoring everything they do in the way of writing regulations on trade and so forth, and prepared to really become very seriously tough if they move in protectionist directions. And I mean by tough that we are going to have to start closing off our markets if they begin to close off theirs. Now, I don't think that's necessary. But what I do think is necessary is we have to be engaged every day in pushing them to write the right kind of a charter for their organization. If we do, and if they and we are relatively open trading partners, I think on the whole it's a benefit. There will be some pain in it, but on the whole it's a benefit. Next, coming this way. Oh my God, okay, you and then you.
Sir Bill Rogers, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. In light of particularly what happened this week, have we gone too much to the signal intelligence side of the house and less to the human side of the house? And if so, how do you propose that we change it?
We made that mistake some years ago, and we're paying for it. The use of technology as a tool for intelligence gathering there's no question, it's clearly very important. But a computer can't tell you what's in Saddam Hussein's mind. And what we have done is so much emphasized the technical side of intelligence gathering that the human, what we call the human intelligence side has withered on the vine fairly substantially. And you don't rebuild that overnight. You can build a new computer tomorrow morning, but you can't get somebody into the higher echelons of the French government or whomever else it is that can tell you what's going on. So how do you solve it? How do you deal with it? I think we've already begun to try to deal with it, which is to try to change the emphasis a bit. But it's going to take a long time, and the not danger, but the problem now is that, again, with the end of the Cold War, there's a real feeling in the Congress that why are we spending all this money anyway? And then, of course, when you miss predicting an explosion in India, it gives these people another whole hook to hang their arguments on. I happen to believe that we need a central intelligence agency, and we need an ability to be in everybody's knickers if we have to be. So hopefully the process of beginning to shift the emphasis back a bit will continue, but I think we're going to have a tough fight on budget grounds, if nothing else. Yeah, the checkered shirt and then the gentleman with the fancy necktie.
Secretary, am I correct in assuming that you don't view the United Nations as being willing or able to be this global police force?
No, in fact, you've caught me up on something that I should have been more precise about. I don't see any, I want to be careful when I talk about this global police force, because it has to be a step at a time, and I don't know how far we go. But I don't see any other way to do it other than through the UN. In this, when I say do it, what is it I'm talking about? The establishment of earmarked forces from any number of countries that are available for use by the Secretary General with the approval of the Security Council. I'm not totally out of my mind. I mean, so that the President of the United States, we still have the veto. But if the Security Council approves of the use of these forces for issue X, they can then be sent, and each country contributes something. And the reason I say this is, first of all, unless these forces have operated together and have put together the communications equipment that is interchangeable and so forth, they're going to wander off the way they did in Yugoslavia in 16 different directions at once and not get anything accomplished. But I do think there is reason to put together a UN force, a UN force of contributed troops from a number of different states which maneuver together, will get their strategic doctrine by and large together, and their equipment together. Now, what is it used for? Here's where it gets to be touchy, because if you're not careful, we will find ourselves knee-deep in the UN running everything, and that I don't want either. But let me give you from my own personal experience. If we had had a NATO force, if we within NATO had been able to agree before the Yugoslav collapse that we were going to put together a force that could be used in the event that the Yugoslav state collapsed, it would have made so much difference. I can tell you when the Yugoslav mess began, it was real agony on the part of me, for one, and I know for the President, the Secretary of State, and everybody else as well, to try to decide what it was, if anything, we were going to do. Because we were going to be walking right into the middle of what at least was a civil war. And if you weren't careful, you got trapped into being supportive of one side or the other. And that leads you then to become the target of the one you're not the captive of. And Vietnam was staring at us, and we could see a situation in which you'd go in with 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000 troops, assuming you could get the American people in the Congress to agree with it, and they'd get there, and then you would find that that wasn't enough. And lo and behold, as in the Vietnam case, all of a sudden you got 500,000 troops there, or you cut and run, either one of which is bad. So if we had had the kind of multinational force that could have gone in there so that the burden was being shared, so that we could say the burden was being shared, and it would be provable, it could have made a big difference. We could have probably, with sufficient force in the early days of the Yugoslav collapse, have avoided most of the awful consequences we've seen now for the last 5 years. So all I'm saying here is, I think there clearly is a need for such a force because of what I see coming at us if we don't do it. It needs to be under the UN because I don't see any other place to put it. But at the same time, it needs to be surrounded by all sorts of qualifications and guarantees that it will not act without the explicit agreement of the United States. Yes, sir.
You mentioned his name several times, Saddam Hussein.
Yeah. Should we have killed him before?
Should he, why did we leave him in power?
We didn't know where the hell he was. Look, this is, no, seriously, this is one, when it first became a question, I had to take an extra blood pressure pill every day. But I don't have to do that anymore. Look, here was the situation. First of all, we did not know where he was. If we had kept going to find him, it certainly would have meant fighting in the streets in Baghdad, and a lot greater loss than was the case as it happened. Secondly, and this is where I think we did make a mistake, and it was the fault of the generals more than anybody else. Where we did make the mistake was that we didn't spend another 24 to 48 hours wrecking what was left of the Republican Guard. That, there's no question. But I can tell you, do you remember the pictures of the highway with all of the strewn bodies and tanks and trucks and
Didn't seem
everything?
like we was having too much problem there.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, George Bush looked at that and said, my God, haven't we done enough? And, you know, he was getting a little bit, he was reacting a little bit to the slaughter. And the generals were saying, yes, we've done enough. Well, we haven't done enough. So I think that was where we did make a mistake. But I can only tell you, finding Saddam Hussein, we'd have been there for weeks, if not months more, trying to find him. The losses would have been far heavier. And when he was dead, who would take his place? I don't know. Well, he couldn't have been any worse, but he might not have been much better. And I'll make one other point, and this does not really relate so much to the killing of Saddam Hussein, although to a degree. And this is the sort of thing that Americans react, what I'm going to say, Americans react badly to because it's immoral or amoral, and it's not nice. When that war was over, the United States could not have a situation in which there was no longer an Iraq, and it had broken up into 2 or 3 states. The reason for this being, Iran sits on the other side of that Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is absolutely essential to global stability and to the security of the United States. If we ended up with a fragmented mess of nothing on the Iraqi side, a Kurdish state, a Shiite state, a Shia state, none of which were strong enough to do anything. If we had ended up with that, I can guarantee you we would have had another war with Iran before very long, because they would have tried to dominate the Gulf. Now, it's not nice to say this, but I have to tell you, if you try to look more than 2 or 3 months ahead of yourself, sometimes you come to some very nasty conclusions, and this is one of them. And as I say, this only marginally relates to Saddam Hussein. If we could have found him, if he'd shown up on the corner of Pennsylvania and Fort Peete Street, I can assure you he would have left there feet first. But, so if he had been easily found, we wouldn't have hesitated, I think, to help him meet his maker. But the point is, we couldn't find him, and the longer you stayed tearing up the place, the more you were going to have to paste it back together afterward. But most important of all, you lose too many GIs. Yes?
Yes,
Let me just interrupt a minute. I discover time after time that despite women's liberation, women never ask questions. And it disappoints me, ladies. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned Russia, and I think when the Soviet Union existed, people referred to Russia as upper voltage rockets. I've heard that expression. But they still have those rockets. They still have their germ warfare weapons. They have a very well-educated population. But everything I've heard about Russia since the Cold War ended indicates that for the vast majority of people, the standard of living has dropped precipitously.
Right.
A huge increase in crime. It's basically a kleptocracy. Given all these factors in the fact that Russia really doesn't have a democratic tradition, except for about a week with Alexander Kerensky about 80 years ago. He called that democracy.
Show off. Show off.
Do you think now is the time to expand NATO right to Russia's borders
No.
and perhaps within Russia itself?
Oh my God. Your description of Russia and what it is and what it may become, it's absolutely correct. And it's too easy to sort of assume now that they've fallen on bad times, that's the end of it. First of all, you're right, the nuclear weapons are still there. And since I'm the guy that negotiated and signed the START II treaty, I have a certain personal feeling that it's too bad it hasn't been ratified and performed on, because it would have gotten rid of a very large number of those weapons. But that may yet happen. We may yet be able to work in agreement with it. But there's no question that you've got a Russia that, as I tried to indicate earlier, put yourself in the psychological mode of having been a world power one day and not much the next. And then you get to the question of, does NATO expand, and if so, how much? And I have to tell you, I started on one side and I have kind of slid the other way. I believed firmly in NATO expansion when it first was proposed. And frankly, if it had moved much faster, I probably wouldn't have changed my mind. It isn't that I've totally changed my mind, but I tell you, I'm much more cautious about it now. The three that we have now agreed to take in, okay, it's done. Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. And there is certainly an argument, a very good argument, that it's more than time, for example, that everybody told the world that Poland was not simply the crossroads between armies going to Moscow or going to Berlin. And I'm going to interrupt myself to tell a story, and I can only tell this because my name is Eagleburger, so it's clear I have a certain German history. A Polish soldier was asked, if Russia and Germany invaded Poland at the same time, who would you shoot first? He thought for a minute and he said, the German. So I said, well, why did you say that? And he said, business before pleasure. But, so that much of the expansion, okay. I have become much more cautious, however, in the sense that as you push it toward the Russian border, you really are thumbing your nose at it. And you reach at some point, I mean, if we're going to take in any more, I really don't want to take any more. Are we going to take in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia? Are we going to take in the Ukraine? Are we going to take in Bulgaria? And if we do, remember something. When they come into NATO, we have guaranteed their security. And if the Russians attack Latvia, we are supposed to dash off and defend Latvia. Now, have you looked at where Latvia is? I mean, you know, there could be a real stretching of this thing much too far. So I think it's okay for these three, but I think it is a process we need to take a very deep breath about and think about some more. Not only because of the impracticality of it, but also because I really do, you know, I'm a hawk from way back, so anytime I could stick it to the Russians, I wanted to do it. But in this case, I must tell you, I think this pushes it too far. The closer you get to the Russian border, the more you really have told them you're not relevant anymore. And then the more they're going to try to prove to us that they are. Ladies, yes ma'am, thank goodness.
Look at the challenge. This is a country that argues very publicly over its foreign policy, the recent Israeli issue.
Yeah.
You're advocating leadership. Around what principles and how does this country become a leader?
Well, we are a leader, whether we like it or not, but in the specific terms in which I'm talking about. Good question, but it's, here again, properly argued, first of all, it's self-preservation. It really is. What are our interests? And laid out, I at least think you could make a pretty good argument that any other choice of a direction is not going to serve our best interests. Secondly, and it really is related to this, because this issue of what are our interests can cover anything. So sort of subdivided within that are, for example, the whole question of global stability. I don't mean the stability of the graveyard, but what I do mean is, if it is true that more and more it is now a global economy, and more the well-being of the people of the United States is going to depend upon our economic condition. And that economic condition is going to depend very much upon our ability to compete in a global market. Then I'm drawn back to say, I don't see any other way to reasonably well defend the concept of an ever-increasing and open global trading system and economic system. Now, all of this is very much in terms of self-interest. I can give you a couple of moral reasons, which I frankly think make sense, but and one of those is that the only way, I've said that badly, it is going to be much easier to encourage the development and strengthening of democratic systems around the world, in a world in which there is stability and promise of economic growth. And that it is precisely the other kind of a world that leads to the Hitlers or the Milosevic's of today, and leads to the man on the white horse who comes in to try to save the people from disaster. That people who are hungry don't care much about whether they vote tomorrow or not. What they want is a piece of bread. Democracy and everything that goes with democracy is a fairly expensive proposition. And it really can only succeed, it seems to me, in most cases at least, if it's within the context of a relatively stable situation in which there is at least a relative opportunity for economic progress. And what I'm worried about, frankly, is a chaotic world. It isn't going to be World War III, at least not for a while. But it can be chaotic as hell, where nobody can count tomorrow on whether they're going to be able to do business in country X or not. Where nobody can be sure that we aren't going to have to send the 82nd Airborne Division some way tomorrow morning. It's the uncertainty of the world into which we're moving that worries me as much as anything. And what I'm talking about is trying to make it a little bit more certain. And the only way that can happen, it seems to me, is collectively. We can't do it by ourselves. But it won't be done without us, I'll tell you that. It can't be done without us, and it won't be done even with us pushing, hauling, shoving, and yelling. Our wonderful friends and allies are going to be very reluctant. I think they can be persuaded, but they're going to be very reluctant. Classic case again. I have yet to get this one through my head. But when Yugoslavia began to collapse, wouldn't you have thought that since it's in Europe, the Europeans would have wanted collectively to try to do something about it? Huh. Not only did they not think they ought to do something about it, they weren't prepared to even begin doing anything about it unless we were prepared to be there with them. I have to back up and say that's not true. At the very beginning, I was told by a foreign minister who shall remain nameless except that he had a French accent, that don't worry about it, we Europeans will take care of the Yugoslav situation. Did they? Of course not. And yet here it is in Europe, and they couldn't do anything about it. Which gets me back to the question at the back of the room there, in the sense of, when is it that they are able to come to grips with something like that without us there to organize it and sort of manage it? And the answer is, I think that's a long time coming. I will tell you, when there was a German who came to see me, again, I'm picking on my German, there was a German diplomat who came to see me one day and was complaining because we had not done enough in Yugoslavia. And I said, why don't you do it? You've got all the road maps. You've been there before. He left without speaking to me. Which gets back to my point about the Machiavelli principle. It is really lucky I left when I did, or we might now be at war with 3 or 4 other countries. I'm ready to go on, but I don't want to bore you people to tears. In the back.
Mr. Secretary.
Wait just 1 minute. Would you hand me the cane?
It's over there. It's over here.
Okay. All right, now I'm ready.
As President of our United States, what could you do that would unify us as a country to take position in a world that is in apparent disarray as our South was, as we seceded from the 1960 or 1861 United States? What would you do now to prepare us?
Oh, boy. Well, I'll tell you the first thing I'd do.
Let me sit down.
Yeah. The first thing I would do is, I shouldn't say this. Go ahead. If you're going to lead, to some degree at least, you got to lead by example. And I will say nothing more than, if you have trouble keeping your pants on when you're president, it doesn't help.
Amen.
No, so see, I think we are in a nasty period in this country. I accept that, and I think it's equally the fault of both political parties. I don't even argue that, but I do happen to believe that starting with trying to provide an example of seriousness of purpose and seriousness of character, you can begin to bring the American people around, and it goes beyond that in precisely this issue of what we're talking about tonight. I really do believe that if you present the American people with a problem and a suggested solution, most of the time they're prepared to be with it. I don't think I think we underestimate ourselves all the time. And I don't believe that it would be that hard. Well, it wouldn't be easy, but I don't believe it would be impossible if you describe to the American people what this world that we're going into is going to look like and how important it is that we play the right role. I think you could probably over time convince 51% at least. And I don't know how else to answer the question. I really don't, because what it requires is, first of all, a willingness to talk to us and to describe what you're thinking about and what the problems are and how we ought to deal with them. And secondly, a willingness to listen and to get a dialogue going. And this sounds so naive, I understand it, but I don't see any other way to do it. And one of the problems that bothers me most about our country right now is that instead of that, what we're doing is yelling at each other. And I don't think that has to continue. And I will say to you that Newt Gingrich is just as bad at it as anybody on the other side. I mean, we're all of us making some serious mistakes, and most of them unnecessary. But I will say this, and this I suppose is partisan, but it isn't meant to be. But unless you've got a president that you can respect, it makes it much more difficult. And I don't mean by respect that he's got a 61% approval rating or whatever it is. Character does make a difference, and that's as far as I swore I wasn't going to get into the political side of this at all. But I really do think it makes a difference in precisely the question you're asking. Yes, sir.
What you said about American readiness is frightening, but yet, what is the incentive for our allies to really get in and help if we maintain extreme levels of readiness, extreme budgetary largesse to keep all our forces at top-notch? As long as we're doing it, why should they get in and help?
No, it's a perfectly good question, and I have to split it a bit in the sense that what I'm talking about now in terms of what's happening to our defense establishment is almost apart from, well, it's partly a function of the budget, but it is also partly a function of requiring our armed forces to do more than they were intended to do on the basis of the budget we passed. So you kind of got this vicious circle. And it isn't that what's happening to our defense establishment is deliberate. It's happening because we're doing a lot of things wrong. And I don't mean we're about in a stage of collapse, but I must tell you, it is much worse, I think, than the public discussion. And I was really shaken when I was at the Air Force Academy listening to what's happening to the Air Force. And a very good friend of mine is an undersecretary of the Air Force, and he laid it out to me in spades. And something's got to be done about it publicly, and I'm trying to figure out what. But anyway, the point is, you have a perfectly legitimate question, but it's been a question we've had for the last 50 years. If we don't do it, maybe they will. But if we do it, they won't, because they can ride on us. And the fact of the matter is, if we don't do it, they won't. And the fact of the matter is, if you take a look at the last 50 years of contributions to the NATO defense budget, the Europeans have in fact done pretty well. Now, with the threat gone, that may change. In fact, it's already changing. But here again, it seems to me, the only answer I have to that, and I come back again to, isn't it interesting how weak we are as the world's only superpower? Weak is the wrong term, but it hasn't changed much what it is we're able to accomplish. Because, you know, we may be the world's only superpower. We've got more nuclear weapons and holes than almost anybody else. But I have to tell you, a nuclear weapon doesn't do you much good when you're arguing with London. So, again, what I'm saying here is, it is the force of our arguments. It is the ability to put a squeeze on here and there when we have to. And there are lots of ways in which we can squeeze. I think it'll never be perfect, but I think we can get more out of them than we have. And what's more important is, and it gets back again, if they'll shoulder some of the burden in places like Yugoslavia, or the flights, the intelligence flights over Iraq, so that we can put our pilots back on a reasonable flying schedule so that they aren't worn out after 3 weeks, it can begin to make a difference. Now, none of this, I don't have a key to open the door. All I can tell you is I'm still reasonably confident that with a purpose that is explainable and is explained, and the alternatives are described, I still think we can make it. We can convince within limits. I've about run out of gas, ladies and gentlemen. But is any more questions? The young gentleman there, and then you, and that's it.
I have a question.
You what?
What is your take on Israel, and why do you think
This happens to me every time. I say one more question, and it is always the most embarrassing one to answer. Go ahead.
Why is it so important to us that they give back the West Bank and Gaza Strip after they had been attacked, and they gained those through a war that was not caused by them?
I gather you have a certain view of what we ought to be doing. It really is the toughest question for me to answer, because I have spent most of my professional life doing everything I could to help the Israelis, including, of all things, during the Kuwait War, going over there and spending my time persuading them not to fight and let us do it for them. And believe it or not, that wasn't easy. But anyway, I must tell you, in this case, I think Mr. Netanyahu is a disaster. I think he has pushed things way beyond what's reasonable. Mr. Rabin, God bless him, if he were still alive, we wouldn't be in this situation. And this is not to say that the Israelis have to give back all of the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Number one, they don't want the Gaza. They'd love to get rid of the Gaza Strip, so would everybody else. Nobody wants to take it. But the fact of the matter isn't whether it's 9% or 13%. The fact of the matter is that, at least in my judgment, and I know Netanyahu fairly well, fundamentally he doesn't want an agreement. And since I don't believe time is on Israel's side, I think, well, if Rabin were still alive and still prime minister, it would really be a different case, and they would have arrived at some sort of an agreement. And none of this is to defend Arafat for 1 minute, but it is to say that it cannot go on the way it has, that the key to some sort of compromise solution rests in the hands of the Israelis, not Arafat, not the PLO. And if he chooses not to not work toward an agreement, but rather to do whatever he can without defeating the agreement per se, but doing everything he can to prevent an agreement, in the end, we're all going to pay a terrible price for it. And I hate to say that. I have never before criticized the Israelis. I've sometimes disagreed with them, but I've never before thought that it was, I mean, I've always understood, and it's terribly important to be understood, I've always understood their security concerns. And all you have to do to understand it is to get up on the mountains or the ridge, not too far from Jerusalem, and look back and see the Mediterranean Sea, and you understand it wouldn't take long to cut the country in 2 pieces. So all of that's there. And they deserve our support, they deserve our security guarantee. But there's something that we deserve in return for that. And that is that we are at least listened to when we give them advice. Yes, sir, that's it.
I have a question about the thesis put forward by, I forget the man's name, the historian who broached the conflict of civilization thesis as the paradigm for the future. The Islamic,
He's showing off
Christian, the Islamic, the Christian, the Western, the Buddhist, and so forth as the paradigm for future conflict in the world, as opposed to the ideological.
You mean Nostradamus?
No, the contemporary historian.
Louis Schwartz.
No, he's a Japanese American. But, that was his.
The end of history. Fukuyama.
Okay.
What about it?
What do you think of that as a paradigm for the future? That now it's going to be more religious, it's cultural rather than ideological.
It's nuts. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The Iron Brigade. And that greatest of generals, Ben Butler. I thought I'd exaggerate just a little. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I said thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, we've come to the conclusion of the program for which most of you came down for. It has been